Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Town Hall from Home. My name is Brian Egolf, and I am the Speaker of the House in the New Mexico House of Representatives. This is our 14th or 15th edition of Town Hall from Home. We get together most Wednesdays and pick a topic of public concern and public interest, usually relating to the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's affecting life here in New Mexico. We don't need a reminder of the health effects of COVID-19. We're seeing, of course, big spikes in cases in our neighboring states, Texas and Arizona. Arizona, by population basis, is per capita basis, is now one of the hottest hotspots in the world. Texas is seeing surges to their intensive care units, and the spillover effect is causing real problems in Doña Ana County and southern New Mexico as a whole as they deal with the inflow of infection from Texas. But there's another effect of the COVID-19 pandemic that gets less attention, but that we're going to highlight now because it makes a big difference. It's a huge factor in the lives of thousands and thousands of New Mexicans. Right now in our state, about 160,000 people are unemployed, and along with that comes the inability to make rent payments and to keep a roof over your head or a roof over your family's heads. It is a very desperate situation, especially as we come close to the expiration date of the $600 CARES Act supplement that is being added right now to unemployment benefits for every beneficiary recipient in the state of New Mexico. Those are about to come to an end. And we don't know, but protections that are currently in place from the New Mexico Supreme Court on evictions may also come to a conclusion in the future at a date to be determined. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty with regard to housing, especially for those New Mexicans who rent a place to live for themselves and their families. But we have with us three people who are starting and who have been working hard to assist, especially the population in New Mexico that rent their residence, that rent their home, rent their apartment, to be sure that they'll be able to keep in their homes or keep in their apartments in spite of the depression, economic recession that we are in right now, and it looks likely to continue for quite some time to come. And we've got two members of the State House, Representative Angelica Rubio from Doña Ana County, and Representative Andrea Romero from Santa Fe County, my neighboring district to the north, who have been working on housing issues in their personal and public lives for quite some time, and will share with us how we got into this very serious situation for so many renters in New Mexico, and policy initiatives that they are working on for the 60-day session starting in January and to help renters specifically, and also what they've been doing in the meantime, along with some ideas that they brought to the special session that weren't able to be considered during the special session due to the omission of those issues from the proclamation. And we're also going to hear from Maria Griego from New Mexico's Center on Law and Poverty. She is on the front lines helping folks keep their housing on a daily basis, and she's going to tell us about what the situation really looks like on the front lines of defending people's access to housing, and what her organization and what she herself is doing to make sure that we're finding solutions to the problems that so many New Mexicans and New Mexico families are facing when it comes to housing during the pandemic. I'd like to start with Representative Rubio. She is our Vice Chair of the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. She has become New Mexico famous, or as we say in Santa Fe, Santa famous, for being the only and maybe first legislator in the history of our state to literally ride her bike to the Capitol all the way from Las Cruces to Santa Fe at the start of the session. It is, I mean, just that alone is incredible, but what she's doing to help folks in her district and around the state is also incredibly admirable, it's important work. Representative Rubio, I'll turn it over to you, and please tell us what you've been working on, and also how we got into this situation where we find ourselves as so many New Mexico families finding it hard to keep housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to everyone who's watching. My name again is Angelica Rubio. I'm humbled to serve the 35th District here in the state of New Mexico in the legislature, representing the great city of Las Cruces, where it's really, really hot right now. I'm also very honored to share this space with my colleagues to discuss this issue that's very important to the state and our future, but also very important as an issue that is very close to the heart of those of us on this panel. As someone serving in the legislature now in my 4th year, I've been working really hard to address a number of issues that are fundamental to the values and the principles that I stand for, which are access to equitable and quality air, affordable food, access to affordable food, free healthcare, guaranteed and dignified wage, and of course, safe and affordable housing. In regards to safe and affordable housing, there are a number of ways that we can address it. And Representative Romero and myself worked for weeks with the Center for Law and Poverty and other advocates to design a housing package that we thought could begin to not only address the inequities that already existed prior to COVID-19, and which this pandemic has unveiled even more so, but also to begin to set a tone on what safe housing should look like for our communities, both in the urban and rural areas, and for generations to come. I'll let Representative Romero speak to the specifics of what we were considering for the special session and next steps, but I kind of want to paint a picture of how we even got here. First and foremost, New Mexico was already in a housing crisis. 50% of New Mexicans were already defined by the Housing and Urban Development as rent burdened. That means that half of our state already paid 30% or more of their income for their rental space. So for those watching, you might wonder, that may not be too bad, but when you're a state that already has the highest number of low-income households in the country, and now facing a pandemic, and where we have also seen that Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are disproportionately hit the hardest, and due to the lack of access to quality healthcare, dignified wage, and paid leave, and being deemed essential workers in many cases with no option to work from home and or have been snubbed completely from their jobs. This all leads to multiple crises that are even more importantly, losing your shelter. The CARES Act, which is something that many of us have talked about over the last recent few months, was legislation that was passed at the federal level, signed by the president in March. But it's only available until the end of this month, which means that many of the New Mexicans I just described will be falling off a very steep edge after living on the brink of one for so long. And so with no real positive sign that the feds will fulfill their duty of supporting states during this time, we also have countless immigrants who were not even included in the first package, like unemployment insurance, for example, much less having a fighting chance in the second package, if there is one, despite paying $1 billion in federal and state and local taxes. And so there was a special session last month, and after many attempts, the governor's agenda did not include the housing package that we proposed, which Representative Romero will describe, nor any other policy that would have addressed this housing crisis. In my opinion, this inaction straight up sent a very strong message that the principle of safe housing may not be a high priority at this time, and that there's not a real sense of urgency. But I want to challenge us all to understand that there is a sense of urgency, because as we head into the fall, we are expecting another spike in COVID-19 numbers and an economic shutdown. And again, no real positive movement from the feds to help sustain the unemployment of many who will lose their safety nets in just under 3 weeks. And so it leaves many of us wondering and losing sleep actually over what will happen to our communities. What will happen to the countless New Mexicans, many of whom are our family, our friends, neighbors, all at risk of living on the streets because of our inability to act. And so Representative Romero and I are committed to addressing this issue, and we hope that we can continue to do so over the course of the next few weeks and months in continuing to work on this issue. In fact, we're reconvening our working group from the special session this week, which includes housing advocates like Maria legal experts, and state government to not only strategize on short-term solutions outside of the legislative process, but to also begin to build a roadmap for long-term solutions that will hopefully guide us by the principle of safe and affordable housing for all that I mentioned earlier. I want to just end by just having us all sort of reflect on something, and that is, what does our home do for us? It's a sanctuary. For many of us, a place that we can rest our head at the end of the day, providing for space to wake up to in the next day, and fundamentally bringing balance to accomplish a lot of the things that we need to get done, whether it's work, caring for our families, eating a home-cooked meal. But now imagine losing all that. Imagine your children, your grandchildren losing all that. How will they recover from this with the added burden of a lost year of school during a pandemic? What will this do to our elders, many just trying to live into their twilight years, and who are medically fragile, now with the added layer of a pandemic and health risks, and surviving without a roof over their heads? If that's not enough, imagine the consequences of not addressing these issues systemically and economically. Recovering from a foreclosure or eviction is a scarlet letter that follows you for the rest of your life, preventing families from ever living in a safe and dignified house. But even more so, the consequences are that much more impacting than we can forget about an economic recovery, because we're risking instead an extension of a previously lost decade and to only enter into another one. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm super passionate about this issue, as you can probably tell. So I thank you for providing us a space to share about this very important issue and our sense of urgency, because it is a critical principle that I personally stand on, both as a legislator, but also personally. But I think it's something that the majority of New Mexicans would agree is an issue that we must address as soon as possible.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for sharing your sense of urgency and your clarity and your focus on this issue with the state and with those of us in the House. I look forward to passing meaningful legislation on this topic in January, and I wish we could have done it in the special session, but we will have an opportunity in a little more than 4 months to get it done, and we look forward to that opportunity. I'd like to now ask Representative Andrea Romero, House District 46, to describe some of the policy proposals that were introduced during the special session and that will be reintroduced coming up in the 60-day session in January. Representative Romero, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Rep. Rubio, for giving us that clear picture of why this is so critical and what we were asking for just a few weeks ago, actually. We were hoping in the urgency of what we are experiencing right now, where we are already seeing renters being evicted from their homes. The state Supreme Court obviously issued a stay on evictions. However, that had no teeth when we were looking at how they've been implemented and how the courts have continued to process evictions. We were hoping that the governor would get the authority to be able to put a moratorium on evictions that we could actually put into place and make sure that we could protect people in place. Again, a house is the #1 social program that we have in the state. And so being able to do that would have allowed people to shelter in place continually while we're in this pandemic. Additionally, we have a statewide rent control provision in our state law that does not allow for local governments to enact rent control measures in their local area. So we were hoping to basically just get into compliance with our own laws that allows for local control, that allows counties, municipalities to help with different relief efforts that may be better deployed on the ground per their local area. Unfortunately, right now, they are prohibited from doing that as well. So we were hoping that come January, that would be at the top of the list for housing initiative, while we hope that we can prevent a tsunami of evictions. So the third component with what we're requesting, which is still an opportunity right now for our governor to act, is through the CARES Act fund and the COVID relief fund that is in the coffers of our governor, is to deploy funds for renters relief and for relief funds on the hundreds of thousands of, 100,000 New Mexicans who were already paying rent that was much higher than what they were receiving in income. They weren't receiving living wages. And while they've been on unemployment, they have been receiving a living wage, but that runs out at the end of this month. So they make their last rent payment in August. And then at 15% of the rental population, that's 20,000 renters, may be receiving eviction notices at the beginning of September when they can't pay their rent because they don't have the income, with just, you know, a couple $100 a week from just standard New Mexico unemployment. They're having to wrestle whether or not to put food on the table, or pay rent. And when everyone received the $1,200 from the federal government, and I shouldn't say everyone, I should just say those that did receive the $1,200, and when we've tracked that with the state through the Mortgage Finance Authority, the majority of people were paying for rent and for food. And so folks are just trying to meet their very basic needs. And that's what we're seeing with unemployment payments. So when those payments do run out, folks are going to be in dire straits. And while evictions are already being processed, and we're seeing that continually in the news, both locally and nationally, while 20 to 25 million renters across the country are going to start seeing these eviction notices, we want to see a response that's robust in New Mexico that can provide that relief, not just to renters, but of course the landlords that have their incomes both passively and actively that are coming from renters today in our state as their income. So this is really averting a crisis. When we see folks that are chronically homeless in our state, it costs the taxpayer $34,000 a year to support them. So it's a fraction of the cost when we can keep people in their homes. And that's what we're asking for today from now until December 31st, is to have a robust plan in place that provides that relief. And then come January, there are going to be numerous efforts for us to continue to support our housing trust, the Mortgage Finance Authority, of which I sit on that committee, to continue to promote housing around the state. But until then, folks are in dire straits. They are in need of relief today, and we're hoping that we can act as a state to provide that support, and hope that the governor's office will be able to receive that message and find a way for us to deploy those funds responsibly and to the folks who need it the most. So we're going to continue to work on this as a coalition, and hope that we can continue to motivate the right direction for keeping people in homes.
Thank you. And you know, it's hard to imagine an effort that is more important and more noble than the public service aimed at helping families and individuals keep their shelter. And you know, this is a problem that has fallen into the laps of so many families, literally through no fault of their own, which makes this situation all the more tragic. You know, all the families and all the individuals around the state who, as you know, as politicians like to say, you know, did everything right. That they, you know, got a rental, they're in a job, and they are providing for their families, and did nothing wrong, and are now in, you know, weeks away from potential crisis and the risk of losing their shelter. It is an economic crisis, but it is a personal and family crisis for thousands and thousands of New Mexico families. It's tragic. And Maria Griego from the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about kind of personal, you know, individual situations that you see happening. You're, as I said at the beginning, literally on the front lines of trying to help families stay in their homes. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and what the Center on Law and Poverty is doing to try to help as we are in this interim period when the legislature is not meeting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing to try to help New Mexico families?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representatives Rubio and Romero. You know, when the pandemic first started, when we were all first on lockdown in early March, there were some protections that came out for renters that at first seemed promising. The first was through the Federal CARES Act. And the CARES Act placed an eviction moratorium on any property that has a federally backed mortgage or receives any type of federal subsidy, like any Section 8 type housing subsidies. And that prevented even the filing of evictions from the beginning of the pandemic through July 25th. The second protection was an order issued by the two orders really issued by the New Mexico Supreme Court that stayed evictions in rental properties and mobile home parks. And what that means is that although a landlord could still file for an eviction, if the court ruled against the renter, there could be no execution, meaning the sheriff couldn't go and literally force you to leave your home. And so while those seemed promising, what we're seeing is that in practice, those protections really aren't playing out in protecting tenants in New Mexico. One reason is there's a lot of confusion with the lower courts, some of the smaller courts, the magistrate and metro courts that actually process eviction cases. So there's no requirement that judges do any sort of preliminary questioning or analysis as to whether or not the property is covered by the CARES Act and whether the case should have even been filed. So oftentimes you have landlords bringing these cases which should have never been filed and winning, and the tenant might be required to leave even though it's against federal law. And then we also, there was also confusion around the stay from the New Mexico Supreme Court. Many of the judges did not know that you didn't have to present a COVID-related reason regarding your inability to pay rent. So tenants do have to show that they have an inability to pay rent to have their case stayed, but it doesn't have to be COVID-related. And many of the judges, or at least a couple of the judges, were requiring a COVID-related reason. So while we don't have final numbers, we know that there are probably hundreds of cases where tenants were improperly evicted in violation of both federal and state law. So that's been really concerning. And there's also just a lot of confusion for tenants. People hear rumors that, oh, your landlord can't evict you right now, so they think they don't have to show up to court. And you still have to go to court. Many of the hearings are happening telephonically, but you do still have to appear over the phone and tell the judge that you can't pay your rent right now. And so we had a client just this week who just didn't understand that she had to go to court. She heard that landlords couldn't evict right now, and so she didn't think she had to go to court. And so she didn't show up, and the landlord got a judgment in his favor, and she was required to leave very quickly within a matter of just a few days. So although there have been plenty of cases where the judges have followed the rules and the tenants were not required to immediately leave their homes, we know that as soon as the public health order is lifted and that the stay is lifted, that we're going to have a massive wave of evictions, and we don't have a plan in place currently. And it was really disappointing after worked so hard with Representatives Romero and Rubio on this housing package for the special session that it didn't get anywhere. And tenants are really fearful. We get calls all the time from tenants just in a state of panic. They don't know what they're going to do. They can't pay their rent. They don't know how long they might be able to stay in their homes. And although there are some rental assistance programs available, particularly in Albuquerque and some statewide, they're running out of money. And so we just haven't seen that statewide, concerted effort to keep New Mexicans in their home. And we are just really concerned with what that might look like for our state, who, as Representative Rubio mentioned earlier, is already experiencing a housing crisis. New Mexico had the highest increase in homelessness between 2018 and 2019, with a little bit more than 50% increase in the number of chronically homeless individuals. So we are in a bad situation, and it will only get worse if we don't have a comprehensive solution for New Mexico's tenants.
My tendency in doing these is to say thank you for the comments, but it feels a little strange because the situation that you paint is, as you said, it's very bleak and very concerning for so many. And first of all, I want to thank you for the work you're doing. Also, for folks that are watching who maybe have either themselves or a friend or a relative who's got a notice for any court proceeding, but especially one on foreclosure, never, ever, ever ignore it. File an answer, get a response, call the Center on Law and Poverty, call New Mexico Legal Aid. For any landlord-tenant matter, these are typically filed in magistrate courts or in Metro Court in Albuquerque. There are forms at the courthouse if you can make an appointment and get into the courthouse. There's also forms online that you can fill out to give an answer. But never, ever, ever ignore official court process or court papers, because no matter how serious the situation seems, any lawyer will tell you, you can guarantee the situation will get worse if you ignore it. And so you always want to file an answer. You always want to ask for advice from friends, or use they call pro se help. Those are people that go without a lawyer, pro se. There's lots of resources, especially in landlord-tenant areas of the law, for people who don't have a lawyer to get assistance and to make sure that their rights are protected. And I'm sure the Center on Law and Poverty, do you have resources for folks that are in this situations, Maria?
We do. One thing we have a lot of Know Your Rights materials, and I'll be sure to provide that link so that it can be linked onto the Facebook page, so that you know what you have to do when you go to court, and what your rights are. But another thing, we're just encouraging everyone to reach out to their landlords as soon as they know they can't pay. So as Representative Romero mentioned, we're going to have a whole slew of folks who might have been able to pay because they were getting the extra $600. We're going to have a whole slew of people in August that can't pay their rent that have been able to pay their rent thus far. And so we're encouraging everyone, reach out to your landlord immediately before you miss that payment, and let them know that you're not going to be able to make the payment, and try to work something out. And we have a form linked, and again, I'll link that on our website. It just tells your landlord, I'm not able to pay my rent. I'm protected under the Supreme Court order, but I want to work something out with you. So those all those resources will be linked. Just be proactive, as you mentioned, Mr. Speaker. Call New Mexico Legal Aid, call us at the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty. Make sure you know what you're up against if you're facing an eviction, so that all of your rights are protected and you don't find yourself in a really dire situation.
It's good advice. We'll go to questions in just a second. We've got a lot of good questions. I also wanted to mention, Maria, for you to potentially share the information. But we were able to pass in the special session the New Mexico Small Business Recovery Act. And this took $500 million out of our severance tax permanent fund. And beginning hopefully July 27, individuals will be able to apply for loans up to $75,000 at half, the interest rate is half of prime, which is right now 1.25% interest, with no collateral requirement and no personal guarantee. This would also apply if any of the renters or any of the folks having difficulty are small businesses, if they are contractors, if they, if they have a barbershop, not a lot of employees, many small businesses will qualify and could provide a source of some money for them to make ends meet while the economy recovers. So that will be coming online July 27. If you go to the New Mexico Finance Authority's website, there's an email where you just send an email to it and you'll be added to the list to get updated as the program comes online. Of course, acknowledge not everyone is going to be able to benefit from that who is having a hard time making rent or paying other living expenses. But for quite a good number of people, we think that this program will be available. You'll be able to apply for these loans through places like the Loan Fund, Accion, and other community development financial institutions, as well as the New Mexico Finance Authority. And we put a lot of provisions in that bill to make sure that, that these loans will be made available to people who don't have deep relationships with a traditional bank. So the unbanked and others will be able to have access to these funds as well. So please I mentioned that to you so you can share the information with the folks that you interact with at the Center on Law and Poverty. That was one thing that we were able to get through. It was signed into law, I think, yesterday. So that's coming online here in a few weeks. We have the first question is from Kate Kennedy, and she is saying that she is seeing a number of people who are having leases, according to the landlord, canceled. And Kate's question is, if a lease is canceled, are the tenants still protected from eviction under the Supreme Court's new rule? I'll throw that out to whoever wants to tackle that one.
I'm going to nominate Maria from the legal perspective.
Not exactly sure what she means by canceling. Landlords can certainly choose not to renew your lease, and if you stay behind and in violation of that, you're not protected. You're only protected if you have an inability to pay rent. So the Supreme Court order is only about rent. It doesn't cover any other reason why your landlord might want to evict you. For example, if there's been multiple noise complaints. It's only if you are unable to pay rent.
Okay, so that's an important distinction. So Kate, I guess if rent hasn't been paid and the lease is being canceled, I'll also say, Maria, I'm not familiar that canceled has a legal meaning. So it may be unscrupulous landlords taking advantage of tenants. I've had maybe a dozen landlord-tenant cases in my time as a lawyer, and I've always represented the tenants, and it's kind of been amazing to me what some unscrupulous landlords have tried to do to take advantage of people either with limited skills in English language or without a background that has exposed them to court process, the way they can take advantage of or try to take advantage of folks. And so maybe this using the term cancellation of a lease is an effort to do that, because I've never heard that before either. But I would imagine that if you were able to go into the magistrate court, again, not ignoring the notice, so if the lease is quote unquote canceled, if the tenant doesn't leave voluntarily, there still is going to have to be an eviction proceeding. That's a process where you file an answer. You could make the case to the judge that if this is really sort of a sham claim, that it's being canceled, show the judge that it's because of COVID-related inability to pay rent, try to get them there. The other thing to remember also is if you're a tenant and you get an eviction order out of magistrate court, you can always file an appeal to the district court, which starts everything over and resets the clock and gets you, I would say, at least another 120 days. If you feel like you're being wrongfully evicted. So don't forget, these are all of Maria and I have all these lawyer tricks to extend the deadline. Representative Rubio, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to also add to that. So I was an advocate working for a housing or an organization that did affordable housing back during the housing crisis in 2008. And I feel like so many of the things that us advocates fought against then are sort of reappearing now. And I don't know if this is something that Maria has also begun to witness, is that it's so critical that people, even if, as a legislator, I have a hard time sometimes even understanding the language that is used in some of our legislation or even procedures, that the same can be said for a typical person living in our community who doesn't necessarily understand and how to navigate our legal process. And so I would just encourage people to reach out to one of us or someone that they trust that can get a hold of someone who can get a hold of us or others to be able to help folks navigate this process. Because even though the funding doesn't exist, or it's very limited to support people from getting evicted or to find that temporary housing support, that at least, like you said, Speaker, if a person is able to go from the from one court to the other and appeal it and get an extension. Like, how could we support those efforts so that people know about it, and that so at least if anything, that buys people time. The same could be said about foreclosures. I know foreclosures are different in every state, but the same can be said, I think, for homeowners who are unclear about the foreclosure process, that there's ways that we can try to navigate that. And I'm certainly here to help in the same way that I know Maria and Representative Romero would be as well.
Well, we will definitely be linking somewhere down there to the resources from the Center on Law and Poverty and some of the other self-help resources for folks who find themselves facing eviction. And there's a lot of good information out there. We have a question from Trina Lopez, and this might be for Representative Romero. Are there any plans to adopt legislation that would allow landlords to be paid directly by the state on behalf of their tenants?
Yeah, so there are some, what we were proposing even when we were in the midst of looking at state funds that might be available for providing relief for renters through the Mortgage Finance Authority. If you already have qualified Section 8 housing or anything that is related to qualified housing in the state that receives those subsidies, you can already apply for relief through the Mortgage Finance Authority. So that absolutely exists, but unfortunately, those are already qualified properties. So if you fall in that category, there is already availability of possible subsidies for folks that can't pay rent. However, what we're looking for is another mechanism to do essentially that, but broadening the scope in looking at some of the CARES Act fund that are supposed to provide COVID-related relief that may be able to provide for both landlords and tenants. And we were proposing different ways of evaluating what that would look like, the threshold of need at 120% area median income for those that would qualify for relief, and perhaps they're still unemployed or underemployed at this point in time to be able to provide that relief. But at this point, we don't have, those are sort of the ideas percolated, but without a fund in place to be able to meet that demand. Right now, all we have are pre-existing households that are already qualified that can seek that relief, but it is available.
Let's see, we have Kurt Rager. He's asking about plans for the 60-day session. I think we just heard from Representative Romero about some of the ideas. I'm wondering, Representative Rubio, do you have anything in addition to what we heard from Representative Romero that you might be looking at for the 60-day session? And or Maria, after we hear from Angelica, maybe if you have some suggestions for things that you think we should be doing that you maybe haven't heard as part of today's conversation. But Representative Rubio, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really important question because, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, the working group that was convened prior to the special session is reconvening this week on Friday, actually, to really start working on some of the short-term goals that we have right now in working with the governor's office to try to see if that funding exists to help supplement and broadening a lot of what Representative Romero was just talking about. But this working group is hopefully also going to work towards legislation, either strengthening what policies we had already considered, and also more than that, because I think one of the biggest things that we need to address in the session in January is the amount of job losses that are going to occur in the fall, not only to address the loss of income, but also thinking differently around the issue around housing. I mean, there's tons of examples around, around the world. I was even just reading recently about how Finland has completely and dramatically reduced homelessness in their country. And it's because they've had an opportunity to really be as bold and as rapid things have been moving. They too, as a governing body, have also said we need to just respond just as quickly. And so they're now housing people unconditionally. Like there are here in the country, in the United States, we look at homelessness as you scale up. So we put you in temporary housing, and then we put you into another type of housing, and then you finally get to earn your place. Whereas other places are actually saying, like, no, how do we get there more quickly? But also thinking about it not in just terms of housing, but we've been talking a lot about how do we reimagine our budgets in our state, in our local governments, and how do we invest more in our communities so that in homelessness, people who are who do face homelessness, in this case, as you mentioned earlier, speaker, about people losing their shelter right now because of because without, it wasn't their fault. But even the folks who are homeless now, a lot of times it's because of addiction. It's because of they went bankrupt because of lack of health care, or there's a number of reasons for why that occurred. And so how are we then readjusting our budgets and really thinking through systemically how to invest more in the programs and in the situations that will help people stay in their homes as a fundamental like right, versus eventually getting there and then providing the services that they need to also stay there.
That's great. And there's a conversation that's coming up sort of along those lines, where we're going to begin the conversation about this idea of a universal basic income as a way to make a lot of those goals possible. You mentioned some of the countries in Europe. It's been very successful there in their pilot projects. And I think it's something that we should seriously consider right here at home. Maria, why don't you see if you have any suggestions for us in this 60-day session? Then we'll go to Representative Romero for some final thoughts, and then we will be at our conclusion.
Sure, thank you. In addition to the packages that were presented at the special session that I know, and those issues that I know that Representatives Romero and Rubio are still working on and will push during the 60-day session, there are a few really simple fixes that we could make to New Mexico's Uniform Owner-Resident Relations Act, which is the body of law that governs landlord-tenant relationships. And the first is in New Mexico, unlike many other states, we don't offer tenants the opportunity to cure. And what that means is in another state, for example, if a judge rules against a tenant in a case on Wednesday because they haven't paid rent, they haven't paid any of their rent, but on Thursday, they somehow come into some money, they get paid or whatever, they can go to their landlord, pay the full amount owed, and the landlord cannot get the sheriff out there to evict them from the property. The tenant gets to stay. We don't have that opportunity in New Mexico. So a tenant might be able to pay the full amount owed the very day after the judgment, and they're still going to be required to leave their home, be evicted by the sheriff, have to get their belongings out very quickly. So that's one very simple fix that could be made to New Mexico law. The other, it's also a pretty simple fix, is we don't have a prohibition against source of income discrimination in New Mexico. So landlords can choose not to rent to people based on how they plan on paying their rent. If that comes from Section 8, if their sole source of income is Social Security, landlords can pick and choose. And we've seen that be really harmful now with the pandemic, where folks are getting rental assistance. We have a client that we're currently working on her case where the landlord has flat out refused to accept a rental assistance payment from a nonprofit, just won't take it. And so, and for whatever reason, but we don't have that prohibition in New Mexico. And it should be that if you can pay your rent, whether it's you or somebody else on your behalf, the landlord shouldn't have to take it. You shouldn't be out on the street just because a nonprofit is paying your rent instead of, you paying your rent out of your paycheck. So those are some fairly simple fixes that we could make to landlord-tenant law in New Mexico to just strengthen the protections for tenants.
Those are great ideas, and I saw Rep. Rubio and Rep. Romero taking notes, so that's good. We'll get some final thought from Representative Romero and then Rubio, and then we'll be wrapping up. Any final thoughts, Andrea?
I think, with what we're seeing and talking about, the world has changed, and all of the options should be on the table for how to be able to respond to this, situation, not just in housing, but in so many ways in our state. And, our legislature doesn't meet for another, 7 months or 6 months. It's like tomorrow, as far as we're concerned, with all of the things that we think could help. But it's not enough for what we need today. And I think that when we're proposing these policies, we know we're still in a bureaucratic system, but there are options today for how to provide that relief. And while the world is changing so quickly, we need to make sure we keep families protected and keep New Mexicans protected. So, as much as we can advocate, I would just, if you're interested, if you want to be part of helping us with this housing effort, we've invited everyone to the table to have this discussion. We're working with students at UNM Law School. We're working with, coalitions of folks who are really concerned about just keeping people in place, because it seems like we're at less than a degree of separation from knowing or loving someone that is a renter in a potentially sticky situation with their housing. So we just want to be advocates and do everything we can to make this work. So happy to put that opportunity out there for anybody who's interested or wants to help or is in need. And again, just putting you in the right places with the right folks. But again, this is our real opportunity to do something effective and to plan it out for when we do have the chance to change policy. So just hoping to have folks around the table when that comes time. And today, if you're interested.
Well, we're getting some offers. In fact, just about 30 seconds ago, an email came in from a lawyer in Albuquerque with lots of experience on consumer protection and consumer rights. And I'll be forwarding that to the three of you. It's someone whose name is well known. I don't know if she wants me to announce it on Facebook or not, but it's a very good offer, and you should accept the offer of help.
Well, absolutely.
When you get the email. Representative Rubio, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly want to reiterate what's been shared and thoughts that Representative Romero has. I do want to add also to say that there is no shame in what you're going through as people who are losing their shelter. And so I personally feel that it's imperative that people reach out. I think that in the situation that we're in this pandemic, we've seen a lot of ugliness in terms of the mask wearing and things like that. But I also know that there's a lot of really good people out there. And so I just recommend that people reach out, look out for your family, your neighbors, your community, and make sure that, there's probably people out there who are in the process of losing their home. They're probably ashamed to bring it up. And so just letting people know that there is no shame in what's happening right now and what's happening to you personally, and that you more than anyone deserve an opportunity to save what little you may have at this point. So that's it.
Thank you. And that's an excellent reminder that, as we said at the beginning, so many individuals and families around the state are in or may soon be in desperate situations with regard to housing and their shelter through no fault of their own. If they worked at a retail shop or in a restaurant and the job isn't there anymore because of the pandemic, that's something that they didn't bring on themselves at all. The opposite, in fact. And there are many, many, many good people who are ready, willing, and able to help. There's also, we hear in the news, I think, about a lot of the unscrupulous landlords, the people that give a bad name to folks that are landlords. But there are also, I think it bears mention, a lot of good landlords who, if they know a tenant has a problem, are maybe willing to help. I hear through social media lots of examples of landlords who said, we're just going to stop collecting rent for 4 months to give a break to some folks. So we should give, everyone who's facing a hard time paying rent should give their landlord the opportunity to do the right thing and see if there's something that can be worked out, because there are a lot of good people that are landlords who want to help their tenants and help try to find solutions. But if you are in a situation like that and you don't have a landlord that's willing to work with you, there are lots of resources available now. And if Representatives Rubio and Romero and I and others have our way in the upcoming session, there'll be even more resources there for folks that need help making rent. So we're gearing up for the session. We are going to make progress on this. And in the meantime, as Representative Rubio said, don't ever be afraid or hesitate to ask for help if you need it, because we're all in this together. So as we go into next week, we will be back next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. We may have a surprise guest in the next next 1 or 2 episodes that should get folks excited. So stay tuned to see who's going to be joining us over the next few weeks. And in the meantime, please, as the governor says, if you can stay home, please do so. Please try to limit your trips outside of your house or outside of your apartment, outside of your home for things that are only necessary. Avoid large gatherings, and please continue to wash your hands if you've been out. Maintain physical distancing, and for heaven's sake, please, please, please wear your mask. You're doing it for your neighbors, you're doing it for your friends, you're doing it for your loved ones, because you are showing respect first and foremost when you wear the mask, respect for your community members, respect for others. You're also making a very, very important step in the right direction to slow the spread of COVID-19 and help us defeat the pandemic. So please, please, please wear your mask or face covering. Stay healthy, stay safe. God bless you all, and we will see you next Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Take good care.